Become obvious over the past decade. Victoria Police, once heralded as the best in the Commonwealth, has fallen to new lows. Over 25 years, the force has been infiltrated by darkness. Evidence of cost-cutting, poor judgment, improper practices present in some of the biggest cases in the country. And now the cost. Jason Roberts walking free yesterday after 22 years behind bars after being acquitted of the charges he murdered 2 Victorian police officers back in 1998. It's just one example of how mismanagement and poor handling by police have led to a case to fall. And it's a blow to justice and families of the victims and much more, it says, in terms of the health of Victoria Police. Don't forget Lawyer X and the gangland murders. Joining me now is John Ferguson, Associate Editor at The Australian, who's been following this situation. John, just remind my viewers, this goes back to the cold-blooded murder of 2 Victorian policemen, doesn't it?
Yeah, correct. So it goes back to 1998. Victoria Police were investigating 10 armed robberies in southeastern Melbourne, in the suburb, and they found themselves in the suburb of Moorabbin, a team of police. Among them were Gary Silk and Rodney Miller. Unfortunately, Silk and Miller were executed down a dark street in Moorabbin, and 2 men were charged and convicted and jailed for them. They were Jason Roberts and Bandali Debs. It's the worst occasion probably for Victoria Police in decades, going back to the Walsh Street murders. So that's, I suppose, you've got an environment where a lot of armed robberies, big police presence, 2 police executed, and then this massive police investigation that followed and was ultimately at least partly botched.
We'll get to what the Supreme Court had to say about Victoria Police's handling of this, but in the case of Jason Roberts being freed, there are other charges relating to armed robbery which will continue, but in relation to the murder charge, this has been quite a process to get to the acquittal, hasn't it? This is a series of reviews and appeals, 22 years in jail. Tell us about some of that history.
Yeah, so Roberts was 17 when he was basically, it was said that he murdered these 2 police with Debs, who was in his 40s. Now, Roberts consistently maintained that he did not do it. Now, I wasn't there. I don't know, but the courts have made their decision. We've since learned that Roberts was claimed to be in bed with Debs' daughter at the time of the murders. Roberts, there have been 7 reviews, investigations, appeals, police inquiries, IBAC. It's been looked at the entire way through, fundamentally because Roberts claimed his innocence.
So the Supreme Court dealt another blow, and I say another because I referenced before Lawyer X as well, another blow to the reputation of Victoria Police. They say this is one of the worst cases of mishandling by police. What's going to happen now?
Well, it's the million-dollar question, really, Peter, because what's happened is that, progressively we've been told that this has been bungled at best, potentially corrupt behaviour, I suppose at worst. But when this Roberts walked free yesterday, the VicPol, Chief Commissioner, made no mention at all of VicPol's failures in the handling of statements and other things. Made no mention of it at all. Now, I would have thought that is just such a fundamental and potentially, and this is not to understate the impact on the families of the victims, but it's potentially the biggest issue here, that you have I'll use the word very carefully, but a potential corruption of the process, and a person who you may or may not like, but spent more than 20 years in jail when the Supreme Court has ruled they shouldn't have. So that is such a massive implications, isn't it, for how justice is carried out in Victoria?
You would expect, though, when police are putting a file together for the prosecutor that relates to the cold-blooded murder of 2 of their own, they would have dotted their I's and crossed their T's. They would have got everything right. That's not what the Supreme Court found.
No, and the issue is that if I was speaking to a former policeman who said And as he looked at the case, he said it almost looks like they tried too hard. That basically, and we've seen this before, that when you have police deaths in this way, executions they're terrible, terrible crimes. Emotions kick in, and there seems to be potentially a failure of leadership.
But this is not just a one-off with Victoria Police. This is the problem, and I think this just adds to that constant sense that Victoria Police needs a Royal Commission like we saw in Queensland. There needs to be an honest and genuine long-term appraisal of the last few decades, and not just this case, but Lawyer X and many others as well.
Well, correct. And the interesting thing is, I've not always been convinced that a Royal Commission was necessary. But when you look at what's happened here, it's the timeline's very interesting. So they go to jail, they get convicted, the two killers, in around 2002, and that's where the rot really sets in Victoria Police. You look at the timeline, there are all sorts of issues with, and I'm not saying that it was all corruption related, but certainly, let's say, incompetence at the very least, where you have the sort of Simon Overland period, the Christine Nixon period, a lot of things went wrong. And I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing by them, but there's no doubt that there are issues in Victoria Police that really systemic failures, and Lawyer X being probably the big one, but this is massive. And how the Chief Commissioner, Shane Patton, didn't stand up yesterday and acknowledge Victoria Police's role in ultimately what's happened. It just beggars belief.
I think with an election coming for Victoria, this will be a big issue. John Ferguson, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.